Hi, welcome back. So this is our second video for week 13. We're looking at East Asian religions in transnational circulation. And in this reading, we're going to take a bit of a closer look at the meaning of that term, transnational. This is a chapter called Ðônging in Silicon Valley from an excellent book, Spirits Without Borders, Vietnamese Spirit Mediums in a Transnational Age by Karen FjeIstad and Wen T. Hien. And uh, this chapter looks at how the Lendong spirit possession ritual is performed by Vietnamese immigrants to the U.S., specifically Silicon Valley in Northern California, most famous for the tech industry, but also hosts a sizable Vietnamese American community. And while this is our only reading that's specifically about Lendong spirit possession, it is related to some other readings we've done this semester. If you remember way back to week number 2, we read a selection from Alexander Susi's book, The Buddha Side, and he talked about how the Vietnamese religion, or religion of Vietnam, has two sides, or Ben. The Buddha side, or Ben Pat, and the spirit side, or Ben Tan. And he described in some length these kind of spirit mediumship uh, practices that were, different from Buddhism, but at the same time, many Vietnamese, particularly women, uh, went to spirit medium temples as well as Buddhist temples. Uh, Lendong also closely resembles aspects of Korean shamanism, which we first looked at in week number 6, and then again last week in the writings of Laurel Kendall. And in both Korean shamanism and Lendong, the shaman or spirit medium is a religious professional who mediates between the human world and the world of the spirits or gods. Uh, she, often most commonly a woman, although there are men as well, becomes possessed by different entities, spirits or gods, ancestors, or gods of the household, or even higher level deities, and they take on the attributes of these entities, and they ask the participants in the ritual for offerings, often money. Um, and yeah, so, but different from any of those other readings is that in FjeIstad and Nguyen, we're looking at a transnational phenomenon. So, transnational means institutions, organizations, or other kinds of phenomena that extend across international borders. So, in the coming slides, I want you to think about, and in the participation, for your participation grade this week, I want you to tell me about what is transnational about the spirit mediums described by Fjellstead and Nguyen. So, first, we're going to take a look at the first generation of the spirit mediums in California in the 1970s and 80s, and how they had to adapt the time, place, and content of their rituals to meet local circumstances. Then we're going to look at a new generation, particularly second generation Vietnamese Americans, right, the children of the original immigrants to the U.S., and there are new temples that came up in the 2000s that made big changes and attracted new audiences, including Americans not of Vietnamese descent. And finally, we're going to look at this kind of mobility where Lendong mediums in California became able to travel back and forth to Vietnam. So, first, we'll talk about this first generation. So, as we know, there was the big war in Vietnam from the 1950s into the 1970s. A lot of the people who left Vietnam were South Vietnamese, right? So their government, backed by the U.S., lost the war against the North Vietnamese, and so many people left as refugees following the war. They became what's called boat people sometimes, traveling very long distances out of Vietnam in the sea. Many people died in the trip, but some ended up emigrating to the US. And for those people, they had little time initially for religion. Finding housing, jobs, healthcare, education, learning English takes a lot of time and took priority over carrying out their religious rituals. Although FjeIstad and Wynne point out that religious rituals can help refugees or other immigrants psychologically, and building religious communities can help with practical concerns. And this came up in the reading as well. Uh, so what we find is that the first generation of spirit mediums tended to be older women, grandmothers, who were not necessarily needed in the workforce, and were taken care of by their children. And so these were the first temples to open in California, were by older women. And these women were worried that in the U.S., as in Vietnam at the time, that their practices might be illegal. You might remember that the South Vietnamese government uh, was kind of affiliated with Catholicism, even if it wasn't the official uh, religion of South Vietnam, and that spirit mediumship had been illegal for some time. So things like, the spirit medium practices make some noise. There's music being played, and the people would park outside of their houses. A lot of these early temples were in people's homes, and so people would, be parking on the street, and they were worried that also their neighbors might see this as a very foreign practice. There was this idea that they were doing voodoo or black magic. So this kind of attribution of um, categories from particularly the Caribbean onto the Vietnamese women who do actually very similar rituals in some ways to what is practiced in parts of the Caribbean. So it's very interesting. We see these kind of cross cultural like hybridity, like we talked about in the last exercise, as they built their own altar materials using locally available materials. So we see here on the right, this is from an altar for wandering ghosts, and the statue that this woman chose to adapt is actually that of kind of a Mexican boy. You can see he's wearing a sombrero, a traditional Mexican hat, and he's been made into a kind of Vietnamese figure here. So yeah, a lot of different materials that were not available that they did not bring with them as they fled from South Vietnam. They had to kind of create anew in their new country. So building new statues for the gods, clothing for the statues, music. Right, they had to kind of improvise things. They didn't have any live musicians. They didn't have all the ritual specialists who would write out Vietnamese language kind of contracts with the gods. And like we saw, it's mostly old women. Younger people and men rarely participate in the ceremonies, maybe because they had to work. Also, younger people maybe it seemed like were kind of embarrassed by this part of their culture that they did not necessarily, know from. They grew up in California, right? So this was very foreign even to the kids. Um, and they said that because of work schedules, the ceremonies, which would be kind of held whenever in Vietnam, were only held on weekends, and because they were only held on weekends, they would often do much longer ceremonies than they would in Vietnam. And due to just having a few different mediums, uh, they didn't necessarily have all the same gods that you might see in Vietnam. Because they were only from the south, for example, there were no mediums channeling the spirits of Ho Chi Minh, the communist leader, who was a very popular spirit in North Vietnam. And we saw that in Alexander Susi's book, where that was set in Hanoi in North Vietnam. Also, some spirits that are not so common in Vietnam became very common in California because the mediums who came over liked those spirits, and especially ones that offered healing, which maybe was important for immigrants who were not necessarily able to access the American healthcare system. Okay, so that's about the first generation. The second generation began making their own temples, and after 1986, when Doi Moi, also called renovation, happened in Vietnam, Lendong became less dangerous to practice in Vietnam and became practiced more openly in both countries. And also, there were new kind of lines of exchange between the two countries. And in Northern California, the Vietnamese community grew larger, and new, larger temples opened in the suburbs. These weren't necessarily just in people's homes, but people built second buildings on their property to house these new, larger temples. They started advertising them more. There were more musicians and different ritual specialists, although these were expensive, so not everybody used them. And there was a greater representation of mediums and practices from different parts of Vietnam. The second generation mediums, right, the children of the original refugees, sometimes who got interested in this, sometimes were possessed by spirits that spoke English as well as Vietnamese. And they created what they called Vinglish expressions, right? Expressions combining elements of English and Vietnamese, such as talking about Ðônging to talk about holding a ceremony. And sometimes they even referred to being possessed by the spirits as God entering them. So this was the authors point out maybe some sort of adaptation to the majority Christian culture. They started inviting their non Vietnamese friends and coworkers to the ceremonies, and some of them became very interested in the spirits and even became initiated as mediums themselves. And these new initiates started integrating new non Vietnamese rituals. They give an example of a woman who was interested in Tibetan Buddhism, and she used some Tibetan rituals. She even had a CD of Tibetan Buddhist monks chanting that she played in the temple. So there is kind of this hybridity that we saw in the first reading happening here as well. Finally, a number of mediums became able to travel back and forth between California and Vietnam. They were able to bring some of the materials for altars, such as statues, pictures, vases, and bowls, and fabric, as well as musical instruments and musical recordings back from Vietnam to California. We see on the right here the kind of what they call the hybrid altar. In the front is a statue of Chao Bei, the youngest prince, that was created in the first generation out of a doll that someone bought and then turned into this god or the spirit. And then behind him are actual altar pieces that were imported from Vietnam that are used in Lendong altars there. So it's this kind of hybrid altar that they said is typical of kind of 21st century Silicon Valley temples. Um, Not only that, the second generation, they don't talk about this so much in this chapter, but in the following chapter in this wonderful book, they follow these mediums from California going to Vietnam to get training from a medium there. And also, they communicate with Vietnamese mediums over the internet. Okay, so I think you have a lot of examples now of transnational aspects of this spirit mediumship. So if you could just give me some of those in the participation question, right? Some examples of how spirit mediums in California, described by these authors, are participating in transnational events, phenomena. That'd be great. Thanks so much for your attention, and we got one more video to go.